The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched for nearly a mile in every direction. 847 species had representatives sitting in curved rows that rose toward a crystal dome showing the stars beyond. The chamber buzzed with hundreds of different languages, translated instantly by the massive computer systems built into every seat. Near the back, in the smallest section of seats, sat the human delegation. There were only 12 of them, looking tiny compared to the towering Kreks, or the floating gas beings of Vorthal Prime. Most council members rarely noticed the humans at all. They had joined the council only 200 years ago, which made them newcomers in galactic terms. Dr. Sarah Chen sat in the front row of the human section, watching the day's proceedings with tired eyes. As Earth's chief ambassador, she had attended these meetings for 15 years. In all that time, she could count on one hand how many times the council had asked for human opinions on anything important. Today's topic was trade routes through the Outer Rim. Speaker Vorthok, a massive reptilian creature from Draconis VII, gestured with one of his forearms toward a holographic display showing shipping lanes. The increase in human merchant activity concerns this council, Vorthok announced, his voice echoing through translation systems. They establish trading posts without proper authorization. They expand too quickly into unclaimed space. Chen felt her jaw tighten. Human merchants worked harder than anyone else in the galaxy. They took the routes other species considered too dangerous or unprofitable. They made deals between species that refused to talk to each other directly. But the council saw only the expansion of human territory, not the bridges humans built everywhere they went. These humans show no respect for established procedures, added Counselor Zephyra from the Crystalline Silicate Union. Her voice sounded like wind chimes in a storm. They bypass official channels. They make agreements without council oversight. What Zephyra didn't mention was that her own people relied on human translators for every major negotiation. The Silicate Union communicated through harmonic resonance that most species found impossible to understand. Human linguists had spent decades learning to interpret the musical patterns of their language. Ambassador Kelrick of the Zenthari Surveillance Network stood next, his insect-like features clicking as he spoke. The Zenthari have observed unusual patterns in human behavior. They infiltrate every level of galactic society. They appear in positions throughout our infrastructure. Chen almost laughed. Infiltrate? Humans worked the jobs nobody else wanted. They fixed the air recycling systems on space stations where a dozen different species needed different atmospheric mixes. They maintained the computer networks that translated between incompatible alien technologies. They staffed the night shifts, the dangerous assignments, the tedious positions that kept the galaxy running. The debate continued for hours. Species after species stood to express concern about human expansion. They talked about humans like they were a problem to be managed, rather than citizens with rights. Chen listened to it all, taking careful notes on her tablet. When the vote finally came, it surprised no one. Motion 2847 Alpha passed by a vote of 743 to 1. The Council would restrict human expansion rights in the Outer Rim. They would require additional oversight for human trading posts. They would limit the number of humans allowed to work in sensitive positions throughout galactic infrastructure. Only humanity voted against the motion. As the session ended and delegates began filing out, Chen remained in her seat. She watched the other ambassadors chatting in their groups, making plans for dinner, discussing tomorrow's agenda. None of them looked toward the human section. Ambassador Thylex of the Aquarian Depths floated past in his water-filled mobility suit. Last month, his colony ships had suffered complete life support failure in deep space. Human engineers had worked for 72 straight hours to design compatible replacement parts, using materials available on nearby mining stations. Thylex had never even sent a thank you message. Counselor Morrigan from the Techno-Organic Collective walked by next, her half-machine face showing no emotion. Her people's computer systems ran on hybrid organic digital interfaces that required constant adjustment. Human technicians had been maintaining those systems for decades, learning to think like both machines and living creatures. Without them, the collective's technology would crash within weeks. Chen pulled out her secure communicator and composed a simple message to Earth's governing assembly. After 15 years of watching the Council treat humanity as a minor inconvenience, after seeing human contributions ignored and human rights restricted, she had reached her limit. Recommendation. Protocol 7, she typed. Protocol 7 had been discussed in classified sessions for years, but never implemented. It was the nuclear option. The strategy Earth hoped never to use. But the Council had made their position clear today. They saw humans as a problem, not as partners. Chen sent the message and closed her communicator. Around her, the Great Hall continued to empty as delegates headed to their evening activities. Tomorrow, there would be another session, another vote. Another opportunity for the galaxy's leaders to ignore the species that kept their civilization functioning. But things were about to change. The Council had spent 2 centuries taking human contributions for granted. They were about to learn what the galaxy looked like without them. As Chen finally stood and walked toward the exit, she passed a maintenance alcove where 3 human technicians were working on the chamber's environmental controls. They had been there since before the session started, quietly ensuring that 847 different species could all breathe the same air. Tomorrow, those technicians might not be there anymore. The galaxy was about to discover just how much it needed the species it had spent so long ignoring. 3 months after the Council vote, Captain Marcus Webb stood on the bridge of the human freighter Prosperity, watching cargo containers being loaded at Kepler Station. To anyone observing, it looked like routine business. The containers held mining equipment, agricultural supplies, and manufactured goods. Normal items for trade routes heading toward human colonies. What the observers couldn't see was that those containers also held something else. People. Final count. "Captain?" asked his first officer, Lieutenant Torres. 237 this run, Webb replied quietly. Engineers, translators, medical staff, and their families, all transferring back to human space for personal reasons. The withdrawal had begun exactly as Earth's leadership planned it. No dramatic announcements, no angry speeches at the Council, no threats or ultimatums. Humans simply started coming home. At Nexus Station 7, the galaxy's largest trading hub, Chief Engineer Rita Nakamura finished her shift maintaining the station's hybrid computer systems. For 12 years, she had kept the complex networks running, translating between Krex crystal matrix processors, Vorthal quantum bubbles, and standard digital circuits. The work required someone who could think in multiple technological languages at once. The replacement arrives tomorrow, her supervisor, Administrator Kilos, mentioned during their final briefing. Kilos was a tall, thin Altarian who had never quite understood what Nakamura's job actually involved. A techno-organic specialist. Very qualified. Nakamura nodded politely. She had spent the last month writing detailed manuals and creating diagnostic programs. The techno-organic specialist was indeed qualified for maintaining pure techno-organic systems, but Nexus Station ran on technology from 12 different species, each with its own logic and quirks. No single species except humans had ever learned to work with all of them simultaneously. "I've prepared training materials," she said, handing Kilos a data tablet. "The emergency protocols are especially important. If the Krex systems start overheating, you need to adjust the Vorthal cooling systems manually. But only after checking with the Zenthari monitoring network." Kilos glanced at the tablet with the expression of someone trying to read a foreign language. "I'm sure everything will be fine." On the other side of the galaxy, Dr. James Harrison finished his last translation session between the Aquarian Depths and the Solar Wind Empire. The 2 species had been negotiating a water rights treaty for 18 months. Their languages were so different that even advanced computers couldn't handle the nuances. Aquarians communicated through pressure waves in liquid, while solar wind beings used electromagnetic pulses. Harrison was one of only 15 humans who could translate between them fluently. "The final documents are ready for signing," Harrison announced to both delegations. "All terms have been agreed upon," the Aquarian representative, floating in her mobile water tank, pulsed agreement. The solar wind delegate flickered his approval through the light panel of his containment suit. Neither species had thought to ask what would happen to future negotiations once Harrison returned to Earth. Throughout the galaxy, the pattern repeated itself. Human doctors finished their assignments at multi-species medical facilities, and requested transfers home. Human merchants completed their existing contracts but politely declined renewals. Human technicians trained their replacements and submitted resignation notices. The withdrawal was so gradual that most species barely noticed. Ambassador Chen continued attending council sessions, though she spoke even less than before. When asked direct questions, she provided brief, polite answers. When the council voted on matters affecting humans, she cast her votes without comment. "The humans seem unusually quiet lately," observed Councillor Morrigan during a break between sessions. "Perhaps they finally understand their place," replied Speaker Vorthak with satisfaction. The recent restrictions have had their intended effect, but Kelric of the Zenthari had begun to notice patterns that troubled him. His people were natural observers, skilled at detecting changes others missed. The data streams from his surveillance networks showed subtle shifts throughout the galaxy. "Human activity has decreased by 12% across all sectors," he reported to his superiors. "Trade route efficiency is down 3%. Interspecies communication delays have increased by 7%. His supervisor, Director Zeltar, clicked his mandibles dismissively. "Minor fluctuations. Human withdrawal from expanded activities was expected after the council restrictions. But the pattern suggests something more systematic," Kelric insisted. "This appears coordinated. Planned." "Let them plan," Zeltar replied. "What can humans do that truly matters? They are useful for minor services. Nothing more." On distant colony world Kepler 452b, Maria Santos packed the last of her belongings into transport containers. She had managed the agricultural program that fed 3 systems for 8 years. Her hybrid crops combined Earth plants with alien soil conditions, creating food sources that could grow in environments hostile to most galactic species. The local administrator, a floating gas being called Wisp of Evening Stars, drifted anxiously around her office. "But who will manage the next growing season?" Wisp asked, his translated voice filled with concern. "The food programs feed billions of beings. I've trained your agricultural staff," Maria replied. "The procedures are all documented." What she didn't mention was that her hybrid plants required constant genetic adjustments based on changing planetary conditions. The local staff could follow the procedures she had written, but they didn't understand the underlying science. When problems arose, and problems always arose in agriculture, they would need to figure out solutions on their own. Captain Webb's ship departed Kepler Station right on schedule. As they jumped to hyperspace, he sent a coded message to the other human freighters operating throughout the galaxy. Exodus, proceeding smoothly. Estimated completion in 18 months. The galaxy's leadership remained focused on their debates and territorial disputes. They had bigger concerns than the quiet departure of a few human workers. The Kreks were arguing with the Silicate Union about mining rights. The vegan collective was having trade disputes with 3 different systems. No one noticed that the people who translated these arguments, who maintained the communication systems that carried these debates, and who actually solved the practical problems behind the political disagreements, were quietly disappearing. The humans were walking away, and the galaxy was too busy to watch them go. 6 months after the first human workers had begun leaving their posts, Administrator Kilos stood in the central control room of Nexus Station 7, staring at a wall of flashing red warning lights. The techno-organic specialist they had hired to replace Rita Nakamura knelt beside an open control panel, his biomechanical arms deep in a tangle of wires and crystal matrices. "Status report," Kalos demanded for the 3rd time in an hour. "The Kreks thermal management system is rejecting inputs from the Vorthal cooling network," the specialist replied, his voice tight with frustration. "I've never seen crystal technology behave this way. It's like the systems are speaking different languages." "But you said you were qualified to handle multi-species technology," Kilos said. "I am qualified for techno-organic systems. But this station runs on 12 different technological philosophies. The human who worked here before, she somehow made them all communicate with each other. I don't understand how." Across the room, sparks erupted from another control panel. The station's artificial gravity flickered for a moment, causing several floating gas beings to bump against the ceiling before it stabilized. 3 sectors away, The Krellian Empire faced a different kind of crisis. Supreme Commander Thyrax stood in his war room, surrounded by charts showing food distribution networks across 47 worlds. All of them were flashing critical shortage warnings. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "Our agricultural production hasn't decreased. Our transport systems are functioning normally." His aide, a nervous young officer named Velek, consulted his data tablet. "Sir, the issue appears to be with the crop varieties themselves. The human-modified plants that feed most of our colonies are dying." "Dying? Dying?" "Plants don't just die for no reason." The human agricultural specialist who managed our food programs returned to Earth 4 months ago. Before she left, she warned us that the hybrid crops would require genetic adjustments every few months to adapt to changing planetary conditions. Thyrax's eyes narrowed. "And we didn't think this was important information?" "The local specialists said they could handle it, sir. They had all the documentation and training materials." "But..." Velek paused nervously. "The crops are failing on 17 worlds. The local teams can follow the procedures, but they can't adapt when new problems arise." Meanwhile, at the Galactic Communication Center on Centauri Prime, Chief Operator Zixtal of the Crystalline Union stared at his screens in growing panic. Communication delays throughout the galaxy had increased from 7% to 23% in the past month. Worse, complete communication failures were occurring daily. The problem was the relay stations scattered throughout space. Each one handled messages between multiple species with incompatible communication methods. The stations required constant fine-tuning to translate between electromagnetic signals, quantum entanglement patterns, psychic transmissions, and dozens of other forms of communication. Humans had operated most of these relay stations because they were the only species capable of learning every major galactic communication method. Now the stations were running on automated systems that couldn't adapt to the subtle changes that occurred in long-distance transmission. "Another relay failure in the Vega sector," reported his assistant. "That's the 5th one this week. Send a repair team," Zixtal ordered. "Sir, we've already sent teams to the other failed stations. They can fix the hardware, but they can't repair the translation protocols. Those were custom designed by human operators for each specific relay point." The crisis deepened when the Aquarian Depths and the Solar Wind Empire discovered they could no longer communicate directly. Dr. Harrison, their translator, had returned to Earth a month ago. The two species were in the middle of implementing their water rights treaty, but without translation services, they couldn't coordinate the complex details. Ambassador Coral Song of the Aquarians pulsed frustrated messages into her water tank, but the solar wind delegates couldn't understand the pressure wave patterns. The solar wind beings flashed urgent electromagnetic signals, but the Aquarians had no way to interpret them. "Perhaps we can use computer translation," suggested Coral Song's aide. They tried. The computers could handle basic concepts, but the treaty involved complex legal terms and technical specifications that required cultural context. Within hours, misunderstood messages led to accusations of treaty violations from both sides. At the Galactic Council, emergency sessions were becoming daily events. Speaker Vorthak called for order as delegates shouted over each other in dozens of languages, many of which were no longer being properly translated. "The communication failures are affecting our ability to conduct basic council business," announced Councillor Morrigan. "We need immediate solutions. The Zenthari surveillance networks are detecting system failures throughout the galaxy," added Kelrick, his insect features clicking with agitation. "Food shortages in the Krellian Empire. Infrastructure failures at 17 major stations. Communication breakdowns between 41 species pairs." For the first time, someone asked the obvious question. "Where are the humans?" demanded Ambassador Thylex of the Aquarian Depths. These problems began when human workers started leaving their positions. Ow. Ambassador Chen, sitting in her usual spot in the back section, stood slowly. Every eye in the chamber turned toward her. For 6 months, she had said almost nothing during council sessions. "The human delegation appreciates the council's concern," she said in a calm voice. "We are reviewing our galactic engagement policies in light of recent legislative changes. What does that mean? Vorthok demanded. It means, honored speaker, that humans are considering our role in galactic civilization. The Council has made it clear that our expansion and involvement in galactic affairs is unwelcome. We are simply adjusting our participation accordingly, but essential services are failing, protested Councillor Zafira. Chen tilted her head slightly. With respect, the Council voted that humans occupy too many positions in galactic infrastructure. We are correcting that situation. Surely this is what you wanted? An uncomfortable silence fell over the chamber. For the first time in Council history, the delegates were beginning to realize that the minor species they had ignored might not have been so minor after all. Commander Zara al-Rashid, the last human engineer still working on Nexus Station 7, watched the system failures multiply with grim satisfaction. She had volunteered to stay behind specifically to observe what would happen. As she prepared her final report for Earth, she documented each failure in careful detail. The galaxy was discovering that humans hadn't just occupied positions in their civilization. They had become the invisible foundation that held it together. And now that foundation was quietly crumbling. 1 year after the human withdrawal began, Admiral Kreshtar of the Vegan Collective stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching enemy ships approach through the asteroid field of the neutral zone. The Solar Wind Empire's fleet had taken aggressive positions near 3 disputed star systems, their electromagnetic signatures blazing with hostile intent. They're moving to blockade the Kepler shipping lanes, reported his tactical officer. Sir, this looks like preparation for a full-scale invasion. Kreshtar studied the tactical display with growing unease. Under normal circumstances, this situation would never have escalated to actual fleet movements. The Vegan Collective and Solar Wind Empire had maintained tense but peaceful relations for over a century, precisely because they had reliable ways to communicate their intentions. But these were not normal circumstances. Have we received any response to our diplomatic messages? He asked. No, sir. The communication relay stations in this sector failed last week. Our signals are being transmitted, but we don't know if they're being received or properly translated. The communication breakdown had started small. A few missed messages here and there. Some confusion over trade negotiations. But as more relay stations failed and fewer human translators remained active, the problems multiplied rapidly. The Solar Wind Empire saw vegan ships moving toward the border and interpreted it as an invasion fleet. The vegans saw solar wind vessels taking defensive positions and assumed they were preparing for attack. Neither side could clearly communicate their actual intentions. Sir, the tactical officer said urgently, the solar wind ships are charging their weapons. Battle stations, Kreshtar ordered reluctantly, prepare for engagement. Within hours, the galaxy's first major war in 3 centuries had begun. On Nexus Station 7, Administrator Kilos stood in what used to be the command center, now filled with sparking equipment and the acrid smell of burning circuits. The station's central computer had finally suffered a complete cascade failure. Emergency lighting flickered as backup systems struggled to maintain basic life support for 3 million beings of 200 different species. How long until we have primary systems back online? He asked the emergency repair team. Chief Technician Valorak, a crystalline being from the Silicate Union, made a sound like breaking glass. Administrator, we need someone who understands how all these different technologies were integrated. The human who designed these systems didn't just connect them. She created translation protocols that let them work together as a unified network. Can't we contact her? We tried. The communication systems aren't working well enough to reach Earth, and even if they were, why would she help us? We ignored her recommendations for months, and then refused to increase her compensation when she warned us this would happen. Kilos slumped in his chair. Nexus Station 7 had been the galaxy's premier trading hub. Ships from across all known space came here to exchange goods, negotiate deals, and conduct business. Now it was slowly dying, and with it, the economic networks that connected 47 star systems. Meanwhile, on the distant world of Kepler 452b, the agricultural crisis had reached catastrophic levels. Supreme Commander Thyrak walked through empty granaries that should have been full of food for the winter season. The human-modified crops had failed completely 3 months ago. And local food production couldn't support the billions of beings who lived in this system. Status report, he demanded grimly. 17 worlds are now experiencing critical food shortages, reported his aide Velek. The local agricultural specialists still can't figure out how to modify the crop genetics. They understand the basic science, but they can't adapt to unexpected problems the way the human specialist could. What about importing food from other systems? The transport coordination systems are failing, sir. The logistics networks that managed food distribution were mostly run by human companies. They've all withdrawn to human space. Thyrak looked out the window at the dying fields stretching to the horizon. How did we become so dependent on one species without realizing it? The crisis had spread far beyond individual sectors. The Galactic Banking Network, which handled currency exchange between 847 different monetary systems, had collapsed when human economists returned to Earth. Each species used different concepts of value, different mathematical systems, and different approaches to trade. Human economists had spent decades learning to translate between all of them, creating the complex formulas that made galactic commerce possible. Without those translation systems, trade between many species had simply stopped. At the Emergency Council session, Speaker Vorthak faced the worst crisis in galactic history. War was spreading as communication failures led to more misunderstandings. Economic systems were collapsing, critical infrastructure was failing throughout known space. The situation is beyond acceptable parameters, announced Director Zeltar of the Zenthari. Our surveillance networks indicate system failures in 73% of all multi-species facilities. Economic activity has decreased by 45%. Military conflicts have increased by 300%. What do you recommend? Asked Vorthak. We must contact the human government immediately and request their assistance. A wave of uncomfortable shifting swept through the chamber. For a civilization that had treated humanity as a minor nuisance, the idea of formally requesting help was humiliating. On what terms? Asked Councillor Morrigan. Zeltar consulted his data tablets. Our analysis indicates that humans were central to 73% of all interspecies cooperation projects. They provided translation services for 89% of diplomatic communications. They managed 67% of all multi-species technical systems. They operated 54% of critical infrastructure facilities. The numbers were stunning. Humans represented less than 2% of the Council's population. But they had been involved in nearly 3/4 of everything that made galactic civilization function. They were the invisible foundation, Zeltar continued. They connected species that couldn't work together directly. They solved problems that required understanding multiple ways of thinking. They performed the services that everyone needed but no one wanted to do themselves. Ambassador Chen sat in her usual spot, listening to the debate with calm attention. When Speaker Vorthak finally acknowledged her presence, she stood slowly. The human delegation appreciates the Council's recognition of our contributions, she said. We are prepared to discuss terms for renewed human participation in galactic affairs. Terms? Vorthak repeated. Yes, honored Speaker. It appears that humanity's role in galactic civilization has been significantly undervalued. We wish to correct that situation. For the first time in Council history, the galaxy's most powerful species found themselves in the position of needing something from the species they had spent centuries dismissing. The humans had walked away quietly, without threats or demands. Now the galaxy was discovering the true cost of taking them for granted. Outside the Council chambers, the war between the Vegan Collective and Solar Wind Empire continued to spread, dragging more species into a conflict that could have been prevented with a simple translation. Throughout the galaxy, critical systems continued failing, as the absence of human expertise created cascading problems that no other species could solve. The foundation of galactic civilization was crumbling, and only one species knew how to rebuild it. 2 years after the human withdrawal began, the Galactic Council faced a civilization on the edge of collapse. The Great Chamber that once hosted dignified debates between 847 species now echoed with desperate arguments and accusations. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across empty seats, where delegates from war-torn systems should have been sitting. Speaker Vorthak called the session to order with little of his former authority. The Draconis VII leader, who had once dismissed human concerns, now struggled to maintain basic order as crisis reports flooded in from across the galaxy. "The agenda today consists of a single item," he announced with grim finality. "The human crisis." The phrase would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. How could humans, the smallest delegation in the Council, constitute a crisis for galactic civilization? Now everyone understood the terrible irony. The species they had treated as least important had turned out to be the most essential. Admiral Kreshtar attended via emergency communication link from his battle-damaged flagship. "The war in the solar wind sectors has spread to 12 systems," he reported. "We've tried to establish ceasefire negotiations, but without proper translation services, every attempt at diplomacy fails. Our species are literally fighting because we cannot understand each other." The situation reports continued. Administrator Kilos described how Nexus Station 7 had been abandoned after complete system failure, cutting off trade routes that connected dozens of worlds. Supreme Commander Thyrak reported mass starvation in the Krellian Empire. As agricultural systems continued failing without human expertise, Director Zeltar of the Zenthari presented the most comprehensive analysis. "Our data indicates that galactic civilization is experiencing cascade failure across all major systems. Transportation efficiency has decreased by 67%. Interspecies communication has failed in 89% of diplomatic channels. Economic activity has collapsed by 78%. Military conflicts have increased by 400%. The Zenthari surveillance expert paused, his insect features clicking nervously. "Most critically, we are losing the technological integration that made our civilization possible. Different species are retreating into isolated technological islands that cannot communicate with each other." Councillor Morrigan's half-mechanical face showed something approaching desperation. "Can we not rebuild these systems ourselves? Surely we can relearn what the humans did." "Negative," Zeltar replied. "Our analysis shows that humans didn't just operate these systems. They created entirely new ways of thinking that bridged the gaps between incompatible species. They developed hybrid approaches that combined multiple technological philosophies and cultural frameworks. This required them to understand how dozens of different species solve problems." He gestured to his data displays. "For example, when Krex crystal technology interfaces with Vorthal quantum systems, the interaction requires understanding both mathematical logic and intuitive probability assessment. Humans could think in both ways simultaneously. Most species can only think in one mode or the other." Ambassador Chen listened to the reports with the same calm attention she had shown for 2 years. As the only human still attending council sessions, she had become a figure of both hope and fear. Everyone knew she held the key to resolving the crisis, but no one knew what price humanity would demand. When Speaker Vorthak finally addressed her directly, the entire chamber fell silent. "Ambassador Chen," he said formally, "the Galactic Council formally requests assistance from the United Earth Assembly in resolving the current crisis." Chen stood slowly. After years of being ignored and dismissed, she now commanded the attention of every delegate in the galaxy. "The human delegation acknowledges the Council's request," she replied. "Earth has carefully considered our role in galactic civilization during this period of reflection." She paused, looking around the chamber at species that had once barely acknowledged human existence. "We have learned that our value lies not in seeking permission to participate, but in choosing when and how to contribute. The recent crisis has clarified humanity's actual position in galactic affairs." "What are Earth's terms?" asked Vorthak directly. Chen activated her personal display, showing a document that had been prepared months ago. "First, voting rights in the Council must reflect actual contribution rather than population size. Humanity requests voting power proportional to our involvement in galactic infrastructure and services." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. This would give humans significant political influence despite their small population. "Second, all restrictions on human expansion and territorial claims are to be immediately withdrawn. Humanity will determine our own growth patterns based on our assessment of galactic needs. Third, Chen continued, the Council must formally acknowledge that galactic civilization depends on cooperation between equals, not hierarchy based on assumption and prejudice. The terms were not merely about human rights. They represented a fundamental restructuring of how galactic civilization would operate. And if the Council accepts these terms? Asked Councillor Zafira. Then humanity will return to our positions throughout galactic infrastructure. We will restore the communication networks, repair the integration systems, and help end the current conflicts. We will rebuild the foundation that makes cooperation between 847 different species possible. Chen's expression grew more serious. But this time, that foundation will be built on mutual respect rather than taken for granted. Humans will not again accept being treated as invisible servants in a civilization we help maintain. Speaker Vorthak looked around the chamber at delegates whose worlds were dying, whose species were at war, whose civilizations were failing. The choice was clear but humbling. They could accept humanity's terms and rebuild galactic civilization as true partners, or watch everything they had built continue to collapse. The Council calls for an immediate vote on the human proposals, he announced. For the first time in galactic history, the vote was unanimous. Motion 2847 Omega passed 746 to 0. With humanity abstaining from voting on their own terms. Ambassador Chen nodded formally. The human delegation will convey the Council's decision to Earth. We expect that restoration efforts can begin within 60 days. As the session ended, delegates began filing out to contact their home governments with news of the agreement. The galaxy would survive, but it would never be the same. The species that had walked away quietly had returned as equals, and galactic civilization would be stronger for acknowledging what they had always contributed. Commander Zara al-Rashid, monitoring the session from Nexus Station 7, sent a final message to Earth. Mission accomplished. The galaxy understands our value now. Beginning restoration procedures immediately. 3 months later, communication networks hummed back to life throughout the galaxy. The war between the Vegan Collective and Solar Wind Empire ended with a simple translated message. We thought you were attacking us. Were you defending yourselves too? Food shipments resumed to the Krellian Empire as human agricultural specialists returned to develop new hybrid crops. Trading stations came back online with human engineers rebuilding the integration systems that let different technologies work together. But this time, every species in the galaxy knew who was making it all possible. The humans had walked away quietly, and in their silence, they had spoken louder than any speech ever delivered in the council chambers. The galaxy had learned that the value of a foundation becomes clear only when you try to build without it.